Right, hello and welcome to the final video in the All Sociology Guide to GCSE Sociology Revision. So I've done 9 of these videos so far, taking in some of the basics, family and education. Today what we're going to be doing is doing one session on methods. I'm going to try and cover the whole lot of research methods in about, I don't know, 25 minutes or so. And I'm also going to try and do an exam question, talk you through one of those as well. So what you should be able to see any minute now is me up in my usual little perch up there in the right hand corner, and I'm going to talk you through, this is the stuff I'm going to go through with you today. So how I'm going to do this is slightly unusual because I was thinking about how I can best get this stuff across to you and recap to you in the most efficient amount of time, and I think this is the way to do it. So I'm going to start off with just going through some like key terms that you should know. I'm going to go through some definitions of what those things mean. Then what we're going to do is have a look at some what I call PET factors, which stands for practical, ethical and theoretical factors. And these are all sorts of things you'll need to think about in terms of what the strengths and the weaknesses of your methods. And then we're going to apply that. And I'm going to split the methods, the different types of research methods, into ones that give you quantitative data. So I'm going to look at things like questionnaires, structured interviews and official statistics versus those which give you qualitative data. And so on that side, I'm going to look at unstructured interviews, observation, participant observation, and also the use of secondary documents. And we'll finish it all off, hopefully, with doing a little exam question, and that should wrap everything up quite nicely. But we'll see how it goes, eh? So, right. Key terms. So I'm just going to bang through a whole load of these key terms. Primary data is data that you, yourself, the sociologist, collects yourself. That's it. Secondary data is data that is produced by somebody else that you then use almost secondhand. So let's say that someone else has done a bunch of questionnaires on whatever it is, what you think of these videos, and I want to know what people think of these videos. I can pick up those questionnaire responses and read them, but I haven't done it myself. Quantitative data is any data, any like output you get from doing your research, trying to find something out, that can be converted into numbers and statistics. Quantitative data, think of that phrase quantity, it's how many something is, it's numbers, okay? Numbers and statistical and numerical data. And then we've got the other type of data, which is what we call qualitative data. So this is anything other than numerical data. It can be words, pictures, feelings, photographs, books, whatever. As long as it isn't numbers, that's qualitative data. All right. Aims. Every research project, every kind of study that a sociologist will do will have some kind of aims, even if that aim is just to explore people's thoughts on whatever it might be. Now, some research projects, tending to be those that use quantitative methods, tend to have a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is a bit more than an aim. It's a statement that you can test is either true or false. So you might have a hypothesis. I predict that people found these videos boring. That might be my hypothesis, and I'd go and do some research to find out whether that's true or not, and your research literally proves whether that hypothesis is true or false. Okay. A sample means the people who you actually speak to as part of your, or do research with. So we can talk about having samples of people that you will speak to. It's just a smaller, we can't speak to everyone in the population, so we take a sample of the population, and that's who you speak to with your research. Response rate is the extent to which people respond to your actual research. Let's say you've sent out 100 questionnaires. If you only get 50 of those questionnaires back, by the way, that would be doing very, very well. You'd have a 50% response rate, and it's much harder. It's when we think about methods like questionnaires, you get a much lower response rate with those things than you do for something like, for instance, an unstructured interview. Closed question is a question that only has a particular answer to it, and you may even give a range of answers that people can fill in your questionnaire or in your research. So how about this one? Here's an example of a closed question. Are you feeling okay? The only examples, only things you can have is yes or no, or kinda, right? Closed question, it's only got one or a very small grouping of answers you can give, whereas an open question you could potentially give anything you want to talk about. So instead of saying are you okay, yes or no, you might say how are you feeling today? I'm feeling pretty good actually, you know, this morning I got up, I felt a little bit drowsy, I've still got a cold, blah 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 blah. Open questions will give you an awful lot more data than a closed question. And then I'm going to get onto these two sticky ones. One is called reliability. Now, reliability in sociological research means something really specific. It means to what extent is that piece of research easy to be repeated by someone else And if they were to repeat it with the same people, would they get the same results? So how scientifically repeatable is that research, basically? And then the other one we've got is validity. Now, validity, again, means something very specific in sociology. It means how truthful, trustworthy, or true to life a piece of data is. So if you've asked somebody a question and you think they've lied, the likelihood is that it will have low validity because it's not going to be true to life. Okay, so there we go. We've got, how many is that? 12 key terms that I've just rattled off, hopefully fairly quickly for you. Now, when we come to look at different types of research methods, we can split these into primary, i.e. the ones you do yourself, or secondary. So here are a bunch of methods. These are like the 6 most common methods you will get asked about in GCSE Sociology. So we've got questionnaires, we've got interviews, and then we can have all sorts of interviews. We can have structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, unstructured interviews, and group interviews. Speak of the devil. Focus groups, also known as group interviews, where you do an interview with more than one person at once. So often it tends to be anywhere up to about 10 or a dozen people. Observation, and there are a variety of types of observation. We can talk about covert observation, which is when you go undercover and people don't know that you're watching them. We can talk about overt observation, which is when you are overcover and people know you're watching them. And we can talk about participant, where you as a sociologist actually get involved with the behavior of the group you're studying, or non-participant when you don't. Okay. We've also then got 2 second, and they were all primary methods, by the way. The secondary methods, I'm going to look at one quantitative, which is official statistics, and these come straight from the government, and they can produce statistics on all manner of things, and you can find some of those easily for yourself as a sociologist by looking at the internet. And then the second secondary method I'm going to mention is documents. So this tends to give more qualitative information. And when we think about what a document is, we actually mean one of potentially 3 things. We either mean a personal document that someone's got, so it might be someone's diary or someone's social media account, for instance. It might be what we call historical document, so this might be something that's a lot older that goes back, but there could be some overlap with personal documents. So it might be, classic example being like Anne Frank's diary is a good example of both a historical document and a personal document. And the last kind of document we can think about is media material, so literally looking at books, magazines, films, TV programs, photographs. All of that kind of stuff will give you qualitative data, but it ain't yours. You've used it from somebody else. Okay, so there's just an overview of some of the 6 most common methods that you might get asked about in sociological research methods. Now, I've got another nice picture here of some beautiful animals, and these are all animals that could be pets. And pets, or pet, is a key analysis to remember when we do research methods, because PET stands for practical, ethical, and theoretical. And there are a whole bunch of factors that are associated with different types of methods that basically can be split along these 3 lines. So if I talk about practical issues, what I'm thinking about here is anything that can practically get in the way of you doing your research well. So there are only really 3 things that we think about when we talk about practicalities. One is time. So how much time have you got? How long is it going to take to do what you need to do? The other is cost. How much is your research going to cost and how much have you got? And often it's not you who's paying for it. It'll be someone else who's commissioned you, who's basically paid you to do the research on their behalf. And then finally, access. So access is like, how are you actually going to get to speak to the people that you want to research? And if you have any problems with any of those kind of things, like you want to do something, but you've only got a few days and you can't do it, or you haven't got enough money to do it, or you don't know how to find the people, you've got a practical problem doing your research. Let me have a quick sip of coffee. Ethical issues. Ethics is doing things in the right way, and all of these things will pertain to things that can happen if you do not do things in the right way. So there's a bunch of things that we need to do as sociologists. We need to stick to these ethical guidelines. Number 1 is making sure that everyone is safe from harm. You shouldn't bring anyone into any kind of harm, both physically or emotionally or mentally, as a result of you doing your research. Secondly, probably most importantly, before you get anyone to participate in your research, you will need to get them to give you what is called informed consent. They need to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, what's going to happen to their data, and they need to agree to doing it. Yeah, okay, I'm fine for you to do that. If you don't get that, you can't really do it. But there is occasions when you might not want to get informed consent, and I'm going to tell you about one of those in a minute. Anonymity is keeping the people a secret. Confidentiality is keeping anything they say that's potentially identifiable a secret. So you're not, if you go and speak to drug users, you're not going to go and, like, when you write your findings up, say, oh yeah, I spoke to Bob Smith and he's 34 and he takes heroin. Or you're going to say, oh, John Smith, who lives at number 24 London Road, or anything like that. It's going to identify them. So you shouldn't be able to identify the people that you spoke to, unless of course they are happy for you to be identified, but I don't think that's that common. And then the final thing kind of goes along with like informed consent is you have a responsibility not to deceive your participants. That means don't lie to them, be honest, and tell them what you're doing and why you're doing it and what's going to happen to their data. So all of those things are what we call ethical issues. If you don't do them, you're doing things in the wrong way or not an ethical way. And then finally, with theoretical considerations, students sometimes find these quite difficult, but they needn't be. All we really mean by this is really kind of like 3 or 4 things. Firstly, it's about reliability. So I mentioned earlier, like reliability means how easy it is for your research to be repeated with someone, by someone else, and for them to get the same results. So let's say I go and speak to 10, I go and do, I don't know, a questionnaire with 20 pupils at my school about what flavor pizza they like the best, right? If I were to give that questionnaire to you and you were to do that instead of me, the idea is that project should get the same results no matter who does the research, whether it's me or you or somebody else. Okay, now the other thing we need to know about is validity, which means how trustworthy, true, or reflecting of reality your data is. Is it true? Is it actually real, or have people lied, or have they made things up? If so, you would argue you have invalid data. The other thing we need to consider is something called representativeness. And often, particularly in quantitative research, one of the aims is to make that research representative, to represent the whole population. So they will pick a sample that includes all different types of people, young, old, men, women, different ethnicities, different classes, whatever, that represent the population. But not all research is supposed to be representative. And often, qualitative research, a smaller scale research, doesn't aim or seek to be representative at all. It's just trying to look to find out what a very small group of people think about something. And speaking of data, that's another theoretical consideration, because some people are going to want or need quantitative data. They're going to want numbers, facts, stats and figures, and others are not going to want that. They're going to want the more kind of rich, detailed, in-depth qualitative information. So let's have a look at some quantitative methods and go through some of their strengths and weaknesses, because if you're going to get asked a question on, which you will do on research methods in GCSE, it's going to basically ask you what are the strengths and weaknesses of this method or that method, okay? So what we mean, or what I mean in this situation, at least by quantitative methods, is the following things: questionnaires, structured interviews, and official statistics. And all of these are what I'd call quantitative methods. They all generally have quite big sample sizes, and what their aim is to develop statistical data about the population. Now, with all of these methods, this is a key rule of thumb. Questionnaires, structured interviews, and official statistics all tend to be 2 things. A, they are reliable, because someone could easily go and repeat those studies again because of the way in which questions have been standardized. So the questions don't alter when you're doing a structured interview, for instance, or a questionnaire. And the other thing as well, all of these methods tend to give us representative data purely because of the sample sizes they can reach. So let's look at like 3 clear strengths of quantitative methods, and we're talking questionnaire, structured interviews, and official statistics. Number 1, quantitative data is excellent because it can help people to measure patterns over time and start to develop trends through graphs and things like that. So one of the reasons we can track, for instance, coronavirus cases at the moment is because we are using quantitative data. We're using official statistics. We can see how many cases happen. We can see where they happen, and that allows us to put things in place to hopefully stop those cases or bring them down. For instance, that's why we're seeing certain parts of the country in a tier 3 lockdown at the moment and others not, because they have got higher rates of cases and infections. Okay, so good application of official statistics and quant data there. The other thing we can say is that all of these methods tend to be highly reliable. And that is because, as I mentioned already, when you have a quantitative method, one of the key points about it is it's been standardized. So it's the same for everyone. Whoever's asking the questions, whoever's doing the research will be asking the same stuff in the same order, in the same way of everybody. And that doesn't change. And that's like a big benefit to this type of data, right? But because of that, what we have is, so we call those questions standardized. If they're the same, they're just standardized. They don't change depending on who you speak to or who's interviewing. And because of this, what we have is it's like the researcher being like at an arm's length from these people. They're not like right close to them. They can't ask them to elaborate on their answers and stuff. They just ask them a question, they get the answer, it gets written down. Ask another question, you get the answer, write it down, blah, blah, blah. And one of the reasons why these types of quantitative methods are chosen a lot is because they tend to be practically quite cheap and quite quick to do, which means that you get a really big sample size. And if the bigger your sample size, the more likely it's going to be representative of the broader population. So not only are we talking about theoretical advantages here, the type of data you get, how reliable it's going to be, but also there are practical advantages, it being cheap and quick and getting a big sample. But ethically, there are very few things that can go wrong with this. All you've got to do is get the informed consent from somebody, and effectively when they complete a questionnaire, you've got their informed consent by them actually doing it. If they don't want to do it, they're not going to do it, and you won't get their informed consent. Okay, so practically, ethically, theoretically, all quite sound. But what about the weaknesses? Because there's always going to be weaknesses. And basically it's this, like, in any situation, if you've got high reliability, you are likely to have low validity. And what we mean by low validity is that the questions that get asked through things like questionnaires, closed interviews, what we're talking about, structured interviews, tend not to actually, reveal the truth. You don't really get to the heart of an issue by doing that. For one, your people, your respondents who are answering your questions, are only answering the questions you've asked them. And only sometimes you might even give them, options in a closed question to put certain answers. Now, if something happens that you haven't thought of and haven't asked a question about, you ain't going to find out about it. So that's one of the big problems with this. Okay, so due to closed questions, we might not get close to the truth of something or really finding out how something works. Now, all right, one of the advantages we've got is that it's great because we've got lots of quantitative data, patterns and trends. We can produce graphs, lovely, lovely, lovely. But what we don't get is any qualitative data. And so we get to answer questions like how much or to what extent people are doing this, or to what extent there's a coronavirus pandemic or anything like that. But we never really get to understand either how something happens or why it happens. In order to get answers to those questions, you have to ask open questions through a qualitative methodology. Okay, and the last thing I'm just going to say here is, like, although I said that it has got some practical advantages with it being quick, cheap and easy, or these methods are quick, cheap and easy generally, what we can say is sometimes we can't be totally sure that we're accessing the right person. So for instance, if I send a questionnaire out and I want it to go to, I don't know, Mrs. Miggins, and actually her son completes it, I'm not going to know that, am I? Because I haven't actually seen them do it. So we could have access issues actually getting to the right people that we want to speak to. And the other thing as well is that these particularly questionnaires tend to have very poor response rates, because as I said earlier, you could send 100 of these out to people. The likelihood is you'll probably only get about 25, 30 back, because the response rate is very low. So you are going to have to think about, if you do this, how many you're going to need to send out in order to get back as many as you need. Okay, so that's a bit about quantitative methods. Let's have a look at qualitative methods. And basically, everything I've just said to you then, if you reverse it, you've basically got the strengths and weaknesses of qual methods. So in terms of its strengths, high validity; in terms of its weaknesses, low reliability. Let's have a look what we mean by this. So fundamentally, I'm thinking about three methods, and the things I'm about to tell you will work for any of these three methods, just like the stuff I told you previously about quant methods. This will work for all of these methods. So if you get a question on, tell me about the strengths and weaknesses of unstructured interviews, participant observation, or documents, you can use all of this stuff. It will work for any of them. First thing to say, these are all qualitative methods, so their sample sizes tend to be smaller, so you don't speak to as many people, but what you do get is a lot more depth and detail from that data that you get from people. So the methods tend to be very valid. We tend to get very close to the truth. We tend to get answers and insight that we may not have previously even thought of. It's very detailed data. And in terms of their strengths, sorry, you might be able to hear something in the background. I think my neighbour's just decided to start World War III because there's a very loud noise outside, but I'm going to ignore him and just carry on. In terms of its strengths, we've got theoretical issues. Again, it's the opposite. Qualitative data helps us to understand issues really in depth, so I can ask people all sorts of things about why they do things, how things work, because I might not know myself. Excellent. Validity, you're going to get really low, you're going to get loads of data, it's going to be highly valid, it's going to get you closer and closer to the truth because you're actually going to find something out. And think about it, if you're watching through participant observation, you see it for yourself, so you know it's real because you've seen it for yourself. Now, one of the practical benefits of using qualitative methods is that they are very flexible. So if things are not going as you hope they might do, you can just change things up. If you want to spend a bit more time with someone, you can do. If you think you're getting some really good quality information out of them, you can ask them some more questions. You can ask people to expand on things. Tell me, what do you mean by that? And often we refer to these little techniques as sociologists as probes. We can ask people, tell me more. Why? What do you mean by that? Can you explain that a little bit further? And you don't get to do that in questionnaires, structured interviews, or indeed official statistics. So what's really good as well is that you can, through those kind of probes, you can actually identify things that you would have never even thought of in a million years. And that's the benefit of getting qualitative data from people. But weaknesses wise, again, we're looking at the opposite for what was with quant data. So weaknesses, reliable. It's it's unreliable. It's very difficult for anyone to repeat any of this stuff because they don't know the conversations you've had. If it's observation, they don't know what you've actually seen and what you haven't seen. If it's documents, you might interpret a document in a completely different way to what I would interpret a document, okay? So it's very difficult to repeat. Now, one of the other things as well, it's not representative, but qualitative research doesn't claim or intends to be representative either. What it's trying to do is get an understanding, a really deep understanding of a small group of people at once. So you might say, okay, let's think about drug users. I really want to find out about drug users. Not everyone in the UK is a drug user, so it doesn't need to be representative, but you might want to find out about particular groups of people and really get to understand why they do things, how they do things, etc. And one of the reasons why it's not representative is because it's so blimmin' expensive. It takes a long time to become a really trained, highly skilled interviewer. And also the cost of these interviewers is massive. So I'm not going to tell you like how much it costs, but it costs several £100, even towards £1,000 a day for somebody who's really good at qualitative interviewing. And believe me, your people who can ask structured interview questionnaires are much cheaper than that because you don't need the same level of skill. The other thing we can say as well with this is that cost-wise, it costs an awful lot of money, but time-wise, the interviews themselves will go on a lot longer purely because of the nature of how they're like a conversation, or the observation could be going on for days or even weeks or even longer. And often we talk about qualitative research being longitudinal, which just means it goes on for a long time. And then finally, the last one we can say is what's wrong with qual methods or qualitative methods is that because you are closer to the participant and you're having that dialogue with them, there's an awful lot more that can go wrong. So things like deception, not getting informed consent from people. This is particularly important if we're doing like covert observation, because when you do covert observation, you don't want people to know you're observing them. So you're deliberately not going to get your informed consent from them. You're deliberately not going to get them to say, yeah, I agree to take part in this, because if you do, you've blown your cover straight away. So there's some ethical issues with qualitative data collection methods. Cool. Right. So I'm going to try and bust through a research methods essay with you. And in the EDUCAS specification, these will be worth 12 marks. And you'll basically get given a question like this. So discuss the strengths and weaknesses of observation as a research method. 12 marks. Now, how you write one of these is ultimately you want to be writing about a page. And what you want to try and do is pull out 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses and top and tail that with an introduction and a conclusion at either end. So what I'm going to do now is just going to talk you through how I would write this essay if I got given it, and I'll give you a 12 out of 12 answer. So the question is about observation, but it hasn't told you what type of observation it is. So tell the examiner that you're aware there are different types of observation. So overt and covert, participant and non-participant, and that different types of observation have their strengths and weaknesses. First strength we're going to talk about: observation. It's a qual method. It's highly valid. It gives you truthful data as you see it firsthand, particularly if you're doing that covert research, because they're not going to know they're being watched. Strength 2, and by the way, it doesn't matter if you go strength, weakness, or weakness, strength, or weakness, strength, strength. Doesn't matter to me. Doesn't care. Qualitative data. One of the strengths of observation is you get lots of detail in your data. It's qualitative. It's likely to give you a better understanding than another method, especially if you're getting involved in actually participating. Think about it. If you're trying to work out how, I don't know, young people behave on a weekend, you can watch them. You might not know what they're doing. So you might not get involved with them and be like, oh, I'm going to get involved with what you're doing, and you're going to understand it more. Better quality data and highly valid. Weaknesses wise, shouldn't be a surprise to any of you because I've just told you that qual methods have very low reliability. It's very hard to repeat by someone else and get the same results because it's very subjective. You don't know what someone else has seen. You don't know how they've interpreted that. So it very much relies on also the skill of the researcher and their ability to take notes as well. So very difficult to do that, particularly if you're undercover. So how do you know you're going to remember everything that you've seen? You don't. It's very difficult to call it a reliable method. And just finally, so our second weakness, what we're going to talk about here is ethically, this is a very difficult or tricky kind of method to use because depending on the type of observation you're going to do, you might have to sort of like put your ethics to one side for a little bit. So again, use that example about you doing covert research. You cannot tell people you're doing covert research because by virtue of doing that, you're not going to be undercover anymore. So you're not going to get informed consent. And the other thing you want to think about as well is when you're doing this, could you potentially cause any physical or any emotional harm to anyone, even if they were to find out that you'd kind of hoodwinked them and you tricked them into pretending that you were their mate, and in fact, all you were doing is trying to find out what they were up to. All right, so there's your two strengths, two weaknesses. Conclusion, what you're going to say basically is, observation has got its strengths and weaknesses. It depends on what kind of topic you're going to be doing this for. And one of the things I didn't say earlier is that observation and qualitative methods in general tend to be used if you're trying to reach what we call hard to reach groups, who are groups in society who might not be immediately obvious who they are. So we might be thinking about things like any criminal activity, so drugs, gangs, football hooligans, anything like that. These are better. Why? Because those people are not going to answer your questionnaire. Unlikely. Okay, so there we go. I've gone through a whole bunch of stuff with you today. Let's just recap what we've done. I went through 12 key terms that you should know. I went through some of the practical, ethical and theoretical factors that you should know when it comes to thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of different types of methods. And then I looked at the strengths and weaknesses of quant methods. So by that, what I looked at was questionnaires, structured interviews and official statistics, and then also the same thing with qualitative methods, but we looked there at unstructured interviews, participant observation and documents as well. And the rule of thumb basically is that quantitative methods are highly reliable and high in representativeness, whereas qualitative methods tend to be low in reliability, low in representativeness, but high in validity. So qualitative, high in validity, low in reliability; quantitative, high in reliability, low in validity. That's it, basically. I think I'm all done. So I'm going to come back to my big screen again. Hello. Just to say thank you, because this is the last one of these videos. It's actually taken me quite a long time to put this stuff together. So I really hope that someone watches it, and I really hope that it helps you out in some way, shape or form. And if it does, like I've said to you all the way through, just be a pal, would you? Whack a little like on it, go and subscribe to this or something like that. Check us out also on Instagram, so instagram.com/allsociology, twitter.com/allsociology, facebook.com, you guessed it, /allsociology, and have a look at some of the other stuff we're doing there. So thank you very much for watching these videos. I massively appreciate it. I hope you found it helpful. Once again, I've been Ben from All Sociology. I appreciate your time. Take it easy. Very much best of luck with the exams and everything else. And if you need anything, just drop me a line. Okay, peace out, people. I'll see you later. Bye.